Imagine waking up one morning, completely certain that the worst chapter of your life is finally behind you. The papers are signed. The lawyers have packed up their briefcases. The marriage, all 12 years of it, is officially, legally, permanently over. And for the first time in what feels like forever, you can breathe again. You tell yourself the truth you have been rehearsing in front of bathroom mirrors for months. You survived. You are free. You are going to be just fine. Now imagine discovering, exactly 72 hours after that moment of relief, that you just signed away access to the largest privately held chain most people in this country have never heard of. Imagine realizing that the man you built your life around, the man whose coffee you made every single morning, the man whose shirts you knew by the way they smelled fresh from the dry cleaner, that man had known the entire time. Not just known, planned, calculated, executed, and smiled across that conference table while you signed your name on the line that handed him everything. That is not a movie. That is not a novel. That is the story you are about to hear from beginning to absolute end. And I promise you, by the time we are finished here today, you will never look at a marriage certificate the same way again. Before we go any further into what you are about to watch, I want you to do something. I want you to think about the women in your life. Your mother, your sister, your best friend from high school, your neighbor who always seems to have everything together. Think about the ones who gave everything to a marriage, the ones who rearranged their careers, their ambitions, their entire sense of self around a man they believed in completely. Think about how many of those women ever stopped to ask where the real money came from. How many of them thought to read the fine print? How many of them understood that sometimes the biggest lies in a marriage are not whispered to another person on a late-night phone call? Sometimes the biggest lies are buried inside holding companies registered in the Cayman Islands. Sometimes the biggest lies are printed on trust documents, kept in a lawyer's office in a city the wife has never even visited. This story is for every woman who trusted and was not told the truth, and it is for every one of you watching right now who deserves to understand how these systems work, how these men think, and, most importantly, what happens when a woman finally decides to fight back. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let us talk about a woman named Caroline. Caroline Mitchell grew up in a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio. Not poor, but not wealthy either. Her father managed inventory at a distribution warehouse for 31 years. Her mother taught second grade and coached the school's reading program every summer until she retired. Caroline was the kind of girl who read every book she could get her hands on, who worked a part-time job at a fabric store every weekend through high school, and who won a partial scholarship to a state university because she earned it with nothing but her own effort and her own mind. She studied business administration, not because it was glamorous, but because she wanted to understand how money worked. She wanted to be someone who could never be taken advantage of, simply because she did not know the rules. The sad and devastating irony of that detail will not be lost on you by the time this story ends. Because Caroline Mitchell, a woman who spent her entire young adult life studying business, who understood balance sheets and corporate structures better than most people she would ever meet, ended up in the one situation that her education had never prepared her for. She ended up married to a man whose entire financial life was a carefully constructed performance, and she ended up signing divorce papers that were specifically designed by a team of world-class attorneys to make sure she would never understand what she was actually giving away. His name was Daniel Hargrove, and on the surface, Daniel Hargrove was exactly the kind of man that a smart, ambitious, self-made woman like Caroline was supposed to admire. He had the Harvard MBA. He had the early career success at a respected investment firm in Chicago. He had the perfectly pressed suits, the effortless confidence, the ability to walk into any room and immediately become the most important person in it. By the time Caroline met Daniel at a fundraising dinner in Cincinnati, she was 29, he was 34. He was already being written about in regional business publications as one of the most promising young executives in the Midwest. His company, a mid-sized private equity firm called Hargrove Capital Partners, had just closed its second fund. His apartment in Gold Coast neighborhood of Chicago looked like it had been photographed for an architecture magazine. He drove a car that cost more than most people's first homes. And when he looked at Caroline across that dinner table and told her he had been watching her all evening because she was the only person in the room who seemed genuinely interested in the conversation, and not just in being seen, she felt something shift inside her chest that she had never quite felt before. She told her sister about it the next morning on the phone. Her sister asked if he was handsome. Caroline laughed and said that was almost beside the point. He had made her feel, in a single conversation, like the most intelligent woman in the room. That was what stayed with her. That was what pulled her back toward him. And that, as we will come to understand, was entirely intentional. They dated for 2 years before Daniel proposed. Those 2 years were, by every account from the people who knew Caroline during that period, the happiest of her adult life. Daniel was attentive, generous, and endlessly fascinating. He introduced her to a world she had read about in business school, but never actually entered. The world of private, equity dinners, and charitable foundation boards, and weekend trips to properties in Nantucket and Aspen. He made her feel like she belonged there. He made her feel like she had always belonged there, and simply had not known it yet. He told her once, over dinner at a restaurant in downtown Chicago, that she would later learn cost $800 for 2 people, that she was the first woman he had ever met who truly understood what he was trying to build. He said he had been waiting for someone who could stand beside him, not just emotionally, but intellectually. She remembered that dinner for years. She replayed it in her mind during the difficult moments later, trying to understand whether it had been genuine or whether it had always been a calculation. The truth, as with most things in this story, turned out to be more complicated than either answer. They were married in September, in a ceremony at a vineyard in the Hudson Valley that was attended by 240 people, most of whom Caroline had met no more than twice. Her side of the church held her parents, her sister, her college friends, her former colleagues. His side held a vast and interconnected network of business associates, investors, and Chicago socialites. Her father shook Daniel's hand at the rehearsal dinner and told him quietly, as fathers do, that Caroline was the best thing he had ever done in his life, and he expected Daniel to take care of her accordingly. Daniel told him he would. He looked her father directly in the eye when he said it. He did not break the gaze, and her father, who had spent 31 years reading people across warehouse floors and loading docks, walked away from that conversation with the distinct and settled impression that Daniel Hargrove meant every word. Years later, when the truth came out, when the story was splashed across financial publications and legal blogs, and was being discussed in hushed tones at dinner parties across 3 states, her father would sit in his kitchen in Columbus and stare at the table for a long time before saying the only thing he had left to say. He said, "I believed him, and I am a man who has been hard to fool his whole life." The first years of the marriage were good, genuinely, unmistakably good, and this matters, because it would be a simpler story if they were not. It would be easier to understand if there had been obvious warning signs from the beginning, if Daniel had been cold or dismissive or controlling from day one. But that was not what happened. What happened was a slow and almost invisible erosion, the kind that you cannot see while it is occurring because each individual change is too small to register on its own. It is only when you step back, years later, and look at the full arc of the thing, that you see how completely and systematically a person can be reshaped without ever feeling the hand that is doing the reshaping. In the first 3 years, Daniel encouraged Caroline's career. She worked as a financial analyst for a consulting firm in Chicago, and he was proud of her publicly, in the way that men are proud when a woman's success reflects well on them. He took her to his work events and introduced her with genuine warmth. He asked about her projects at dinner. He read her reports and offered notes. He was, by every measurable external standard, a supportive and engaged husband. Then in the 4th year, things began to shift. It started with small suggestions. Her hours were long. Did she really need to be putting in 60-hour weeks when they were financially comfortable? She was exhausted all the time. Maybe she should think about pulling back a little, just temporarily, just to give herself space to breathe. And because she loved him, and because she was in fact exhausted, she listened. She moved to part-time. And then the following year, with the easy logic of someone who has already been moved one step in a direction, she moved to no time. She left her job entirely. And the woman who had spent her young life, learning how money worked so that she could never be taken advantage of because she did not know the rules. Quietly and almost voluntarily handed the entirety of their financial life over to the man she had married. This is the part of the story where I need you to stay with me, because what I am about to describe is not unique to Caroline. According to a survey conducted by the National Endowment for Financial Education, nearly 40% of American adults in relationships have admitted to committing financial deception against their partners. 40%. And the people most vulnerable to financial deception in a marriage are almost always the ones who trusted the most completely. Now let us talk about Robert Hargrove, because the invisible man at the center of this story was not simply a background figure. He was the architect. Robert James Hargrove was born in 1941 in a small industrial city in eastern Ohio, the second of 4 children raised by a father who drove a truck and a mother who took in laundry. He grew up in a house where there was enough but only barely. He left at 19 with $300 saved from 2 years of working in a machine shop and a conviction that was as fixed and unqualified as anything he had ever felt, that he was not going to spend his life in a place where the best you could do was stay even. He moved to Houston, where the oil industry in the early 1960s was beginning to generate the kind of opportunity that a man of his particular combination of gifts, intelligence, patience, absolute ruthlessness in the service of his own advancement, and an almost supernatural ability to understand what other people needed before they understood it themselves, could leverage into something significant. By the time he was 25, he had brokered his first land deal. By 30, he had equity in his first well. By 35, he had made his first $5 million. And by 40, in the extraordinary decade of 1980s energy deregulation, when oil markets were reshuffled, and those who were fastest and most ruthless claimed the largest portions of a newly reordered landscape, Robert Hargrove had built something that was no longer simply successful. It had crossed a threshold into a different category, a category where the standard vocabulary of wealth no longer quite applied. His total accumulated holdings, energy infrastructure, commercial real estate, private financial instruments across multiple continents, would eventually be valued, by the most conservative estimates available to those who got close enough to examine them, at somewhere in the region of $1 trillion. All of it invisible, all of it waiting, all of destined for his son. And it was in the early 1980s, at exactly the moment his fortune crossed into that different category, that something happened that would define the architecture of everything that followed. Robert had enemies, not the ordinary kind, the kind that a man makes when his fortune becomes large enough, that the people around it begin calculating what it would mean to control it. There were 2 specific incidents in 1982 and 1983. The details deliberately vague even in the legal documents that emerged decades later, involving people connected to competing energy interests, applying pressure of the kind that men with serious money apply in ways that never quite reach the surface of public record. Robert Hargrove responded not with confrontation, but with something considerably more effective. He disappeared, systematically, deliberately, and with a precision that suggested long planning rather than panicked reaction. He moved assets into structures that made them legally invisible. He stepped back from any role requiring public identification. He closed his visible accounts and opened ones registered under names nobody connected to him. He became a ghost in the financial world, active, powerful, accumulating, but entirely unregisterable to anyone who tried to find him without knowing exactly where to look. Shell companies in the Cayman Islands, holding entities in Luxembourg, investment vehicles in Delaware, registered under names with no apparent connection to him. The connective tissue between them so deliberately complex that forensic accountants, who later examined the structure, described the task of following it as like trying to map a river designed to have no source. And through all of it, he raised his son Daniel at a careful distance, never fully absent, never fully present, providing financially with mechanical consistency while delivering the most important information about the family's true circumstances in carefully rationed pieces that arrived on Robert's timeline, in Robert's way, according to Robert's judgment of what Daniel needed to receive. The habit of keeping financial truth on a need-to-know basis had been installed in Daniel Hargrove before he ever sat across a dinner table from Caroline Mitchell. He had learned from his father that money and disclosure were not the same thing. He had been taught implicitly, and over a lifetime, that the people you loved most were sometimes the people you needed to protect most deliberately from the full truth of what you held. The decisive moment came on an October evening when Daniel was 26 years old. His father called him home to Cincinnati and sat him in the private study and told him, for the first time in any kind of deliberate and comprehensive way, the truth. Not all of it. Robert Hargrove was constitutionally incapable of telling anyone all of anything, but enough. He told Daniel what existed. He described the basic architecture of what he had built. He told Daniel it would eventually be his. He told him the conditions. He told him the protections that were in place. He told him what he was and was not permitted to say to whom. And then he said something that stayed with Daniel so completely that he was still quoting it in depositions, taken years later. He said, "You can love people, but you should never fully equip them. Let that sit for a moment. You can love people, but you should never fully equip them." That sentence, handed to a 26-year-old man who was just beginning to understand who he was and what kind of life he wanted to live, teaching him not explicitly, but through implication and authority, that the measure of your love for someone is not what you give them. It is what you withhold from them for their own protection. Daniel Hargrove carried that lesson into every relationship he would ever have, including his marriage, including Caroline, and it is not a monstrous sentence if you live in the world Robert Hargrove had built and survived in. It is a functional one. But handed to a young man about to enter a marriage, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes the blueprint for a betrayal that will take 12 years to fully execute and 2 more to fully unravel. By the time Caroline married Daniel in September 2003, the structure that Robert had built was a self-sustaining organism. Billions moved through its architecture with a regularity and precision that required minimal ongoing management. The legal frameworks were in place. The trust documents were maintained by a New York firm whose partners had worked with Robert for over 2 decades under confidentiality arrangements that were among the most airtight in their profession. Daniel had pieces of the picture, significant pieces, but the full map had never been given to him because Robert Hargrove had never fully trusted his own son with the complete truth of what he had built. And that doubt, that fundamental failure of a father to extend to his son the trust he required of everyone else, was the first crack in the foundation, a crack so old and so deep that nobody standing on top of it had any idea it was there. Caroline knew none of this. She knew that Daniel's father was distant. She had met Robert exactly once, a single uncomfortable lunch in Columbus during which he was polite, asked her several questions about her background and her work, and revealed absolutely nothing about himself. She drove home afterward, thinking that she had just spent 2 hours with the most unknowable person she had ever been in a room with. She filed the observation away. She did not know that she had, in that single lunch, looked directly at the man who would eventually be at the center of everything. The changes that began in their marriage after the decisive October phone call in the 9th year were, in the early months, almost imperceptible. A slight withdrawal, a new quality of distance in moments that had previously been warm, an increasing number of evenings when conversations were businesslike rather than personal. Caroline noticed. She was always a noticer, but she was also a woman who had spent the better part of a decade inside a marriage she loved and trusted, and the process of dismantling that trust is never as fast or as clean as the people watching from outside imagine it must be. You do not simply decide to distrust someone you have loved for 8 years because the temperature of a dinner conversation has changed. You find alternative explanations. You attribute things to stress, to work pressure, to the ordinary fluctuations of a long marriage. You give the benefit of the doubt because the benefit of the doubt is what love costs, and you have been paying it for so long that you no longer register the expenditure. What she did not know was that Robert Hargrove had called his son to tell him the timeline was moving. The trust had a vesting clause. Daniel needed to demonstrate a sustained period of financial independence without any claim of entitlement from a spouse before the full inheritance vested in his name. The clock was running. The window was not infinite. And what followed in the months after that call was, according to email records that would later enter the legal record, not as cold and immediate as it appeared. Those records showed Daniel resisting for 3 months, trying to find an alternative path, arguing with his father's attorneys about the structure. He ultimately complied, not because the money was more important than Caroline, but because his father had made the argument that Caroline would be safer outside the orbit of the Hargrove fortune than inside it. Robert Hargrove told his son that the people who stood closest to extraordinary wealth were the people most exposed to its dangers. He told him that disappearing Caroline from the inheritance structure was an act of protection. Daniel believed it, because he had been raised by a man for whom this logic was the organizing principle of an entire life, and in believing it, he made the last and most consequential mistake of his existence. He confused his father's operational logic with his own moral compass. And the woman who had trusted him with everything paid the full price for that confusion. It was a March afternoon in the 9th year of their marriage, when Caroline went to pick up a jacket from the dry cleaner, a charcoal gray wool blazer that had been there for 3 months and was about to be donated. She brought it home. She hung it on the back of a chair while she sorted through the rest of the afternoon. And then later, before she moved it to the closet, she did what people instinctively do with a jacket that has been away from the house for a long time. She checked the pockets. It took her less than 4 seconds. The document inside was folded in quarters. 4 pages. Heavy paper from a law firm in New York she did not recognize. Her eyes moved quickly, the way trained analytical eyes move when they encounter a document, scanning structure before content, locating the organizing logic before reading the particulars. The document was a trust summary, a condensed outline of the principal terms of a larger instrument of the kind, produced for a beneficiary, who needs to understand the broad parameters, without being given access to the full filing. She read the words Hargrove Family Irrevocable Trust at the top. She read Daniel James Hargrove, primary beneficiary. She found the number on the 3rd page nested inside a clause as about distribution thresholds. The number had 12 digits. She stood in her kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon in March, and she read that number 3 times. The 3rd time she read it, she sat down on the kitchen floor, and she stayed there for a long time. She did not move for over an hour. She did not call anyone. She did not cry, at least not immediately. What she did in that first hour was think, not about what she was going to say to Daniel, not about what she was going to do tomorrow, about the precise nature of what she was looking at, about what this document implied, about what else existed, about what she knew and what she still needed to know, and what the gap between those two things might legally mean for her. She thought not like a betrayed wife. She thought like the financial analyst she had spent years training to be and had been slowly, gently, lovingly persuaded to stop being. And in that thinking, something that had gone quiet inside her for a very long time began, cautiously, and with full awareness of what it would cost to let it fully wake, to stir. She put the document back in the jacket pocket. She hung the jacket in the closet. She made dinner. When Daniel came home, she was at the stove, and she turned and smiled at him and asked how his day was and gave him nothing. Not a flicker. Not a question that landed 1 millimeter closer to the truth than any question she had ever asked him before. She lived like that for 22 days. 22 days of ordinary mornings and ordinary dinners and ordinary conversations, while inside, she was rewriting every memory of their marriage and cataloging everything she observed. The calls taken in the car, the New York law firm name that appeared on a piece of mail she handled, the financial behavior she noted in a small notebook she kept in the car, the timing of certain large cash movements in their household accounts that had been explained to her casually over the years, and which she had filed away without fully understanding their significance. She was watching everything while appearing to notice nothing. She was patient with complexity. She trusted the process of understanding. Both qualities she had carried since she was 12 years old in a library in Westerville. Both qualities were in these 22 days saving her life. On the 23rd day, she picked up the phone and called Susan Park, not a divorce attorney, a financial attorney who specialized in high-net-worth asset structures and estate fraud. A woman she had researched carefully and chosen for a specific reason. Sun Park had a reputation among the small community of people who dealt with these cases for being the kind of lawyer the other side dreaded seeing across a conference table, not because she was aggressive in the theatrical sense, but because she was methodical, patient, willing to take a case apart, piece by piece, and spend as long as necessary understanding each component before making a single move. She was, in other words, temperamentally very similar to Caroline, which was not a coincidence because Caroline had chosen her for exactly that reason. Their first meeting lasted 3 hours. Caroline brought the document. She also brought the notebook. She brought a handwritten timeline of every moment from the October phone call forward that had registered as unusual in any way. Susan Park listened to all of it. She asked precise, quiet questions. She made notes. At the end of 3 hours, she looked at Caroline across the desk and said 4 words that were the first fully honest financial assessment Caroline had received from anyone in over a decade of marriage. She said, "This is very serious." The agreement they reached was simple in principle and demanding in practice. Caroline was not going to sign the settlement proposal Daniel's attorneys had delivered. She was going to acknowledge receiving it, buy as much time as procedural courtesy allowed, and use that time to build the most comprehensive possible picture of what she was actually being asked to walk away from. Susan Park brought in a forensic accountant named Thomas Reeves. He had spent 23 years doing exactly this work, the painstaking, methodical reconstruction of financial architectures that had been deliberately built to resist exactly the kind of examination he specialized in applying to them. He was a man of deliberately unremarkable appearance whose invisibility in any room he entered was, professionally, his most useful quality. His intelligence lived entirely in his eyes, which were always doing something far more complex than the rest of his face suggested. He worked not by looking for the thing that had been hidden, but by looking for the space where the thing that should have been there was not. And Caroline Mitchell, the woman nobody in Daniel's world had believed was paying attention, provided him, from memory, with 4 entity names she had encountered in passing across the years of her marriage. Those 4 names, when cross-referenced against Delaware corporate registry databases and Cayman Islands public filing records, turned out to be real, not imagined, not misheard. Real names of real entities forming part of the outer ring of Robert Hargrove's concealment structure. Thomas Reeves looked at his notes for a long moment, and then said quietly, and without particular emphasis, that she had just saved them, approximately, 6 weeks of work. Over the following 8 weeks, Thomas Reeves and a small team working under Susan Park's direction built a documented picture of the Hargrove financial architecture from the outside in. Shell companies in the Cayman Islands, holding entities in Luxembourg, investment vehicles in Delaware registered under names with no apparent connection to either Robert or Daniel Hargrove, the connective tissue between them, the paper trails, the cross-ownership structures, the layers of legal insulation, was by any professional standard extraordinarily well constructed. Thomas Reeves described it to Susan Park in a meeting 3 weeks into the investigation, using a phrase that stuck with her for years. He said it was built by someone who had spent their entire life making sure it could never be found by someone who did not already know exactly where it was. But here is what Robert Hargrove had not accounted for. He had not accounted for the possibility that the person doing the finding would be a woman who had been inside the household of the man who stood to inherit it all. A woman who had been paying attention the entire time. A woman who had been cataloging observations in a notebook in her car for months without anyone knowing she was doing it. She had not been given the map, but she had been walking the territory for 12 years, and she remembered every street. Meanwhile, and with a timing that would later appear either deeply ironic or entirely inevitable, Daniel Hargrove had begun his own preparations. The vesting window was not elastic. His attorneys had communicated to him with professional bluntness that delays in reaching a finalized settlement would complicate the qualification condition in ways their most optimistic reading of the trust documents could not resolve. He needed the settlement, closed with a woman who had signed freely and in apparent ignorance of what she was signing away from. The proposal that arrived through formal legal channels was generous enough to seem fair, structured to sever every claim Caroline might have on future assets while appearing to represent a comfortable outcome, calibrated with brilliant callous precision to give her what looked like enough, while ensuring she would sign away any future claim on an amount so far beyond it that the two numbers could not be placed in the same sentence, without the first one becoming an insult. Caroline received the settlement proposal on a Thursday morning. She read it once quickly, then, a second time slowly noting specific language and clause placements. Then she set it face down on the kitchen table. She made herself a cup of coffee. She sat with it for a long time, and then she called Susan Park and said 4 words of her own. "I am ready to move." The formal financial disclosure demand that arrived in Daniel's attorney's office was a document built by a woman and her team who knew considerably more than Daniel Hargrove had any idea they knew. It asked specific questions about beneficial interests in offshore trusts. It named certain entity types. It was structured to make the gap between what was disclosed and what existed impossible to ignore for anyone who knew what to look for. Daniel's attorneys received it on Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, there were calls being made to New York. By Friday afternoon, Robert Hargrove's estate attorneys had been brought into the conversation. By the following Monday, Daniel's team had formally requested a 60-day extension on the disclosure timeline, citing the complexity of his business interests. Caroline received word of the extension request from Susan Park on a Monday afternoon. She was making tea. She set the kettle down. She stood very still for a moment, and then she did something Susan Park said she had not expected from a client in Caroline's position. She laughed. Not bitterly, not dramatically. The quiet, private laugh of a person who has spent a long time being underestimated and has just received the first concrete confirmation that the estimation is shifting. She told Susan Park that was fine. She said they could have their 60 days. Every day, Daniel's team spent constructing their response to a disclosure demand built around documented knowledge of their concealment was a day in which they were walking toward a wall they could not yet fully see in the dark. And Caroline Mitchell was very comfortable in the dark. She had been navigating it in one form or another for the better part of a decade. The 60-day disclosure, when it finally arrived, was hundreds of pages of technically compliant documentation, structured with such deliberate, lawyerly precision around the exact shape of what had been asked that it addressed every specific question, while remaining silent about everything that mattered. Thomas Reeves described it as one of the most carefully executed examples of selective disclosure he had encountered in his career. It told the truth about every specific thing it addressed and was silent about everything that mattered. Susan Park filed a formal challenge with the court the following week. 18 pages of precisely worded legal argument, supported by 47 pages of documentary appendices, naming the 4 entities Caroline had identified from memory, noting that they did not appear in the disclosure, and characterizing the pattern of omissions as consistent with a deliberate rather than inadvertent failure to disclose which, under Illinois law, carried consequences that extended considerably beyond the civil proceedings currently underway. The hearing was on a Tuesday morning in March in a courtroom on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Chicago. It was scheduled as a procedural hearing. A judge, 2 legal teams, 45 minutes maximum. But Daniel did not come alone. He brought a man who signed into the courtroom register under a name that meant nothing to the clerk who processed it. A name registered to an entity with no apparent connection to any of the structures Thomas Reeves had spent months mapping. A man who was in fact Robert Hargrove. The first time Robert had been named in a public legal proceeding in 32 years. He was in the room. After 40 years of extraordinary and deliberate invisibility, the man who had built one of the largest private fortunes in the history of the United States was sitting in a Chicago courtroom where his name had just been processed by a clerk who did not know what she was handling. The Honorable Patricia Graves, 19 years on the bench in Cook County, a reputation for detecting when a financial presentation was managing her rather than informing her, listened to both sides, asked questions of Daniel's lead attorney that landed with surgical precision on the exact pressure points Thomas Reeves had identified, and issued an order joining Robert Hargrove as a material witness to the financial disclosure proceedings. She said she expected full documentary cooperation from all parties. She closed her folder. She left the bench. The room remained completely still for several seconds after she was gone. Caroline did not turn around. She looked straight ahead. Under the table, she pressed her hands flat against her knees. Susan Park, seated beside her, did not say a word. She did not need to. In the 3 weeks between the first hearing and the reconvened session, more happened than in the preceding 3 months combined. The joining of Robert Hargrove as a material witness transformed the proceedings in ways that his attorneys had spent 40 years engineering his life to prevent. Because the moment Robert Hargrove's identity was entered into the court record under his actual name connected to specific documentary evidence of a trust structure, now subject to judicial scrutiny. The architecture he had built to resist visibility was confronted for the first time in its existence with something it had never been designed to withstand. A judge with subpoena power, a forensic accountant who had spent 3 months mapping its outer edges, and a woman whose 12 years of proximity to the man who would inherit it had given her knowledge of specific entities and structures that no amount of legal architecture could fully explain away. Robert Hargrove's attorneys attempted to have the joinder order reversed on appeal and failed. Daniel's team filed 4 separate motions in the interim period, and 3 were denied. The vesting window was running, and the pressure of that deadline was now working against Daniel, rather than for him, for the first time in the entire history of this process. The reconvened hearing lasted 2 full days. Thomas Reeves was on the witness stand for 7 hours. He was precise, methodical, and completely untheatrical, in the manner of a man who has spent 23 years understanding that a financial argument does not require drama to be devastating. He walked the court through the structure he had documented: the entities, the connections, the offshore registrations, the domestic holding companies, the interlocking pattern of asset ownership that, taken in isolation, produced no picture at all, but laid out in sequence produced a picture that was as clear and as damning as anything Judge Graves had seen, entered into evidence in a financial proceeding in her 19 years on the bench. She said so on the record. She said the structure bore all the hallmarks of a deliberate and sustained effort to place significant assets beyond the reach of lawful inquiry. She noted that certain structural modifications to the trust beginning 14 months before Daniel filed for divorce were not consistent with coincidence. She used a word that family law judges use rarely and with full awareness of its weight. She said the pattern was consistent with fraudulent concealment. On the second day, Susan Park stood for cross-examination of Daniel and asked him about an email, a specific email dated 18 months before he filed for divorce, sent from his personal account to his lead attorney in New York. The subject line reads settlement minimization. Qualification window. Its first sentence asked how to structure a divorce settlement that would prevent Caroline from having any future claims on assets he expected to receive in the 14 months following the date of that email. Susan Park read the full email into the record. It took 4 minutes. The courtroom was completely quiet for those 4 minutes. When she finished, she set the paper down, looked at Daniel, and asked one question. When you sent this email, did you know that your wife had no knowledge of the trust or of the inheritance she would be signing away from if she accepted the settlement terms you were preparing? Daniel said he had been acting on legal advice. Susan Park said that was not the question she had asked. She asked it again. Daniel looked at his attorney. His attorney said nothing. Daniel looked at the table. He said, yes. Robert Hargrove took the stand on the 3rd morning. He answered questions with the technical completeness that satisfied the court's requirements and the brevity of a man who intended to give the minimum necessary and nothing more. He confirmed the trust's existence. He confirmed the structure in general terms. He confirmed Daniel was the primary beneficiary. He confirmed the conditions of the vesting clause. And then Susan Park asked him a question that had not been on any preparation list because it was not a legal question. It was a human one. She asked him whether he had ever considered at any point in the years during which this structure was being used to shape the terms of a marriage, dissolution, what the impact of that process would be on the woman who had spent 12 years of her life not knowing the full truth of what she had married into. Robert Hargrove looked at Susan Park for a long moment. He said he had believed the arrangement was structured in a way that would protect everyone's interests. Susan Park said she had heard him say that. She said she was asking whether he had considered Caroline specifically. Robert Hargrove looked at Caroline for the first time since entering that courtroom 3 days earlier. The look lasted 3 seconds. He looked back at Susan Park. He said, I acted as I believed was necessary. And then for the first time in the 3 days of proceedings, in the voice of a man who has said everything he is willing to say in public, he said, nothing more. Judge Graves's written ruling arrived 11 days later, 43 pages. It found that Daniel Hargrove had committed fraudulent concealment of a material asset, specifically his beneficial interest in a trust structure, whose vesting was directly and knowingly tied to the timing of the divorce proceedings. and that this concealment constituted a breach of the fiduciary duty owed to a spouse under Illinois law during the period of marital dissolution. It found that the original settlement proposal, having been made in the context of that concealment, was void as a matter of law. It ordered the proceedings reopened for a full and properly supervised asset disclosure process, conducted under the oversight of a court-appointed, independent financial monitor. It ordered Daniel to pay Caroline's legal costs in full, including the costs of the forensic accounting investigation, as a sanction for the breach of the disclosure obligation, and it noted in a passage that would later be widely quoted among family law attorneys that a court of equity could not in good conscience allow a settlement to stand that had been structured around the deliberate and documented exclusion of the most material financial fact in the marriage. It said the woman who signed those papers had been entitled to know what she was signing. She had not been told, and the law in that judge's courtroom was not going to allow that silence to stand. Caroline received a copy of the ruling at home. She read all 43 pages. She sat with it for a long time. Then she called her mother in Columbus. Patricia Mitchell answered on the second ring the way she always had. Caroline said, "Mom, it worked." Her mother said, "I know. I never doubted it for a minute." The amended settlement process took 9 months under supervised disclosure and independent financial monitoring. The full picture of what existed emerged piece by piece with the particular quality of a thing that has been hidden for so long that the light falling on it for the first time seems almost excessive. The scale of what was documented was remarkable even for Thomas Reeves, who had spent his professional life in these structures. He would describe it in a professional paper published on the case as an anonymized study, as the most sustained and most deliberately engineered example of generational wealth invisibility he had encountered in 23 years of practice, a monument to a single man's conviction that the safest possible life was the one nobody could see. The final settlement figure was never disclosed publicly. That was a condition Caroline herself chose, not because she was pressured to accept it, because she did not need the spectacle. She needed the record. And the record now showed what had happened in 43 pages of judicial language that would sit in the Cook County court system for as long as the court system stood. The number in her settlement bore no resemblance whatsoever to the original proposal. It reflected as fully as the legal instruments available could manage what 12 years of a woman's life inside that marriage had actually been worth. 2 weeks after the settlement was finalized, a letter arrived from Robert Hargrove, delivered by private courier from New York, and addressed in handwriting that was formal and precise in the way that very old and very controlled people write. The letters evenly spaced, the lines perfectly level, as though the hand that formed them had spent a lifetime resisting the small disorganizations of ordinary human emotion. Susan Park called Caroline. She said there was a letter. She said she had not opened it. Caroline drove downtown. She sat in the chair across from Susan Park's desk. She opened the envelope herself. There were 5 pages. She read them slowly in the way she read everything that mattered, carefully, from the beginning, without skipping ahead. When she finished, she folded the pages. She held them in her lap. She did not speak for a while. Then she told Susan Park what the letter said. Robert Hargrove had written to tell Caroline 3 things. The first was that the outcome of the proceedings had been correct, not just legally correct. He used the word right. He said the outcome was right. From a man whose entire professional vocabulary had been built around instruments and structures and strategic arrangements, the word right was not a word that arrived easily or casually. The second thing he told her was about Daniel. He confirmed what the email evidence had shown, that Daniel had resisted the plan for 3 months, that his original love for Caroline had been genuine, that Daniel had ultimately complied because Robert had argued that Caroline would be safer outside the orbit of the fortune than inside it. He said he had believed this genuinely. He said he had been wrong. He did not dress that acknowledgement in qualifications. He said he had been wrong. And then the third thing, he told Caroline that watching her build her case from the inside of a marriage she had been kept ignorant of, using knowledge nobody had given her, accumulated through 12 years of paying attention that nobody believed she was paying, had been the most extraordinary thing he had witnessed in 50 years of watching people operate under pressure. He said he had encountered very few people who performed at the level Caroline had performed throughout the proceedings. He said this not as flattery. He said it as an assessment, offered in the specific register of a man who has decided to say something completely true to someone who has earned the truth from him. He said he was sorry. He said it plainly. He said he hoped the outcome represented something she could build from, rather than simply recover from. Then he signed the letter with his full name, the name that had appeared in public record for the first time in 32 years during those proceedings, and he sent it. He did not ask for a response. He had said what he had to say. He was finished. Caroline read the letter 3 times in Susan Park's office. She folded it. She put it back in the envelope. She sat quietly for a long moment, and then she said something that Susan Park would later describe as the most measured and most complete response she had ever heard from a client in circumstances even remotely comparable. Caroline said, "It is enough. Not enough to forgive. Not enough to forget. Not enough to make the 12 years worth it, or the deception acceptable, or Robert Hargrove into anything other than what the evidence had shown him to be. Just it is enough. Enough to understand. Enough to move forward without the specific weight of not knowing whether there had been any genuine human acknowledgement of what had been done." She stood up. She shook Susan Park's hand. She thanked her with the directness and simplicity of a woman who meant what she said and said exactly as much as she meant and not one word more. She walked out of the building. She drove home. She made dinner. And then for the first time since the March afternoon, when she sat on her kitchen floor with 4 folded pages in her lap and watched the pieces of her old life assemble themselves into something she had never been shown. She slept through the entire night. 3 months after the settlement was finalized, Caroline established the Mitchell Foundation in Chicago. Seeded with a portion of her settlement, focused on 2 things: financial literacy education for women in or entering marriage, and legal access support for women in divorce proceedings who did not have the resources to mount the kind of investigation her case had required. She brought in Susan Park as the foundation's first legal advisory board chair. She brought in Thomas Reeves to design the financial literacy curriculum. In its first year, the foundation provided direct legal support to 47 women across 3 states. Of those 47 women, 31 reached final settlements meaningfully different from what they would have accepted without the foundation's support. Not different in the dramatic fashion of Caroline's case, different in the quiet, practical, life-altering way that an extra $30,000 in a settlement means for a woman rebuilding her financial life at 52. In its second year, the foundation launched a financial literacy program in partnership with 3 Chicago area community colleges designed specifically for women between 45 and 65. In its third year, the foundation co-authored a legal policy brief with 2 family law scholars from Northwestern University that proposed specific amendments to Illinois Family Court procedural rules around trust disclosure in divorce proceedings. 2 of those proposed amendments were adopted by the Illinois Supreme Court's Focused Family Law Committee the following year. One of them, requiring disclosure of any trust in which a party holds a conditional beneficial interest whose vesting is contingent on any marital event, was the direct legislative legacy of everything that had happened in Judge Graves's courtroom. It was a change to the system, a permanent one, the kind that protects women who will never know Caroline Mitchell's name and never know that the protection they have now exists because a woman from Westerville, Ohio once sat on a kitchen floor and chose to think rather than react and to build rather than destroy. Robert Hargrove died 14 months after the settlement was finalized. He died in a private hospital in New York with no public announcement and no obituary bearing his real name, consistent with every choice he had made in the preceding 40 years. The trust vested formally and completely in Daniel's name the day after his death. Daniel received it. Among the instructions left for the period following his death was one that addressed the Mitchell Foundation directly. A single transfer of funds made through the trust's estate attorneys on the day of his death to the Mitchell Foundation's operating account, unconditional, accompanied by no requirement of acknowledgement or public statement of any kind. Caroline accepted it. She put it to work. She made no statement about it. She deposited it, allocated it according to the foundation's existing priorities, and went back to what she had been doing, because the work was the point. The work had always been the point. Everything else, the deception, the legal battle, the ruling, the letter, the inheritance, the death of a man who had built a fortune on the premise that love and full disclosure were different things. All of it was context. The work was the thing that was going to matter after the context was gone. There is a question at the center of this story that I want to ask you now as we approach the end of it. Not a rhetorical question, a real one. The kind I hope you will sit with after this video ends and think about seriously, because I believe it is one of the most important questions any woman watching this can ask about her own life, regardless of whether the financial stakes in her particular situation are anything like the ones in Caroline's story. The question is this: what do you know about the financial foundation of your own life? Not whether your partner is honest. Assume for the purposes of this question that your partner is entirely honest and has never concealed a single thing from you. Set that aside. The question is simply about you and your own knowledge. If the marriage ended today by any cause, would you know where everything was? Would you know the names of the accounts, the structures of any trusts or investment vehicles, the true value of the assets? Would you know enough to protect yourself and your children without having to start from a position of complete ignorance and work backward from almost nothing? Because the research that informed the legal landscape of Caroline's case, research conducted by organizations including the National Endowment for Financial Education, the American College of Financial Services, and a significant body of family law scholarship, consistently finds that the women most vulnerable in high-asset divorces are not the ones who were deceived. They are the ones who simply did not know, the ones who trusted without verifying, the ones who had never been told that trust and knowledge are not the same thing, and that the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for the people who depend on you is to know enough that the love you are giving is a choice made from a position of full information rather than a position of deliberate or incidental blindness. Trust is beautiful and necessary, and the foundation of everything worth having between two people, and it is completely compatible with knowing where the money is. Those two things have been positioned as opposites for a long time in the way we talk about marriage and money in this country, and that positioning has cost women of every background, every education level, every age and income bracket, an extraordinary and unquantifiable amount. Caroline Mitchell says, when asked about the lessons of her experience, that she does not spend any time being angry about what was done to her. She says the anger was real and appropriate, and it served its purpose, which was to be the fuel for the work she needed to do to get from where she was when she found that document to where she is now. She says the anger is no longer necessary because the work continues without it, and the work is better without it. She says the one thing she wants every woman who has ever sat across from her at a foundation event, or read about her case, or found herself in the middle of her own version of the information gap, to understand, is something that feels almost too simple. She said out loud, but that she has come to believe is the most important single piece of financial knowledge any woman can have. She says, you are allowed to know all of it, every account, every structure, every number, every entity. You are allowed to know the full shape of the life you are living, and any arrangement in which that knowledge is not freely and completely available to you is an arrangement that needs to change, not tomorrow. Now, she says she wishes someone had said that to her at 29. She says it now as often as she can to as many women as she can reach with the particular clarity of a person who learned it the hardest possible way and has decided that the cost of learning it should be the last thing it takes from her. We started this story with a woman signing a piece of paper. We end it with a woman who rewrote what that paper meant. There is a version of this story where Caroline loses everything, where the lawyers win, where the money disappears into shell companies and offshore accounts, where she becomes a footnote. But that is not what happened, because Caroline did something that the architects of that entire system had never counted on. She paid attention, she asked questions, and when she finally understood what she was looking at, she did not run. She built her case one document at a time in a rented townhouse with a yellow notepad and a cup of cold coffee. And she won, not just in a courtroom, not just in a settlement figure, in the 43-page ruling that changed what the law required, in the foundation that has helped 47 women and counting, in the Illinois Supreme Court rule change that will protect women who will never know her name. In every classroom session she has run on the west side of Chicago, where she stands at the front of a room full of women between 40 and 67 who came, because something in their own lives told them they needed to know more than they knew. She stands at the front of that room, and she tells them what nobody told her. And she tells them the thing that costs the least to say and does the most good to hear. She tells them, "You are already doing it. You are in this room. That is the action. Everything else follows from this." Here is what I want to leave you with. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about trust knowledge and what you are entitled to know about your own life, please share it, not as gossip, not as drama, as information, as the kind of story that actually changes something when the right person hears it at the right time. Leave a comment telling me what the moment was in this story that stopped you completely. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what conversation this story made you realize you need to have. I read every single one, and if you are not yet subscribed, hit that button now. Share this, and take care of yourself out there, because you are allowed to know all of it, every single thing about your own life. You are allowed to know.